Okay, well, it gives me great pleasure to continue our day-long experience with Gerald Hines and members of the firm from Caesar Pelli. We're very grateful for their being here, and especially grateful for Jerry's accepting the school's invitation to be our first executive in residence. I gave a long introduction at lunch. I just wanted to hit a couple of highlights. First, I did mention, as a native of Houston, I've known of Jerry virtually my entire life, and he's been a mentor and close friend of mine ever since I went to work for him in my first job. I confess that I have shamelessly taken advantage of the fact that his granddaughter Laura is here to lure him to come, but it worked, and Laura, we thank you for exercising whatever powers you might have over your grandfather to get him to come. I was going through some of my old materials, and well, Jerry's been kind enough to respond positively, I think, to every request I've ever made of him. So I'll try not to run my luck out. But I was looking over an interview that I did when I was back at USC almost 14 years ago. And I have a few copies that I'll pass around. There aren't enough for everybody, so we'll just circulate them. But my last question of him in the interview was, when all is said and done, what do you most want to be known for? And his answer surprised me, and I think it's quite telling. First, he said, I never really thought about that. I want to be respected in the business as a professional who built quality projects that others would have to follow or be left behind. I want to be remembered for developing a truly international organization that conducts itself in an ethical way. I don't think I need to generate another dollar to live any better than we do. I'm happy as long as I can ski and play tennis. I just want to maintain our reputation and have something for my young children and grandchildren to follow if they have the desire. That would be great. Jerry Hines.
Well, thank you, Rick. Hines is a private company. We have some 3,200 employees scattered throughout 17 countries. And that has taken, well, I think I started building in about 1952 or 53. And after I had built about 8 or 9 projects, I was an engineer partner in Texas Engineering. I then had enough cash flow after 8 or 9 warehouses and so forth to support my family. And so then I left my partnership and opened an office with a secretary. And so that's how it all started in 1957. And I think the first buildings I got were buildings that I wanted to show a point of difference. When I looked at the office warehouses, they were pretty crummy. And so I engaged the former member, the head of the University of Texas School of Architecture, to help me with a 40,000 square foot building. It was 30,000 of warehouse and 10,000 of office. And we built a really outstanding building. And I got about 5 jobs from that one outstanding building. So I said, that's a pretty good business plan. So then I invested more in working with outstanding architects. Being an engineer, having developed in the mechanical systems in large buildings, I knew that system, and it wasn't hard to move into structures and envelopes around buildings. So we had some 1,100 properties today, completed or managed for third parties. We have over 2,000 institutional, corporate, and private clients worldwide, and we have a full range of service. And when we say that, some part of our business is working for third parties. and to have an organization that has property management where you feed up to in the organization all of the problems that you have in managing a building, and how do you manage that building and operate it at the lowest cost and the greatest efficiency and the greatest client approvals. And then we have a conceptual construction group that when we take a project and they work with someone like Greg, they will go into every facet of that development. In other words, we have in that group mechanical engineers for all of the heating, air conditioning, and so we know what kind of equipment that we're going to put in, what kind of air units. We even design and test and then have those units available to be manufactured for our buildings that reduce the sound level in the space maybe by 35% because we've designed a special type of fan. So we go into integral parts of the system, and then they will work with the structural engineer. We have structures people, we have window wall people that look and know how to get the lowest, the best quality of all of those materials and systems. Because if you're going to build, you can't overrun your cost or your debt as a developer. So we build within 2% of our competition. If we can't, forget it. We can't build it. So we have to know how to build within that parameters. And that's very difficult, I can tell you, unless you have a system of how to do it. Because I did it myself without that. Even though I was an engineer, yes, I could come up with systems, but I didn't have all the accoutrements that we have today. So that's one of the ways that we manage it, and we have managed some 36 billion of real estate. We've established 28 investment funds, and we've co-invested alongside more than 100 different capital sources. So you've got to make a reputation with your partner investors, whether it be Abu Dhabi, the Qataris, Singapore. Those are some of the big sovereign pension funds, and we're trying to make a deal with China right now. So you have to have a reputation of treating people fairly and executing with a professionalism. And that's what we work at day and day, day and night, and day and day sometimes. It goes from day to day. So I think that, and the other thing is the quality of our people. That's really important to us. So we've done something that no one else has done, and we give 50% of the equity that we create in a project to our employees. No one else does that. And that is something, because we think having the highest professional level and quality of people is the way to reduce your risk and perform over a long period of time. And almost all of our senior people have been with us 20 to 35 years, and that's a long time. So we don't have much turnover. So that's important to the way we present our company and the ethics of our company. And we will continue to be, as long as I'm alive, a private company, because we can do things that a corporation or a public company could never do. So, but go ahead with the next slide. Our global reach, the way it started, we divided the country into, you'll see that a little later, into 4 or 5 regions, and each of those has a CEO. And those people initiate the projects and then come back to Central. They've got an idea, they want to buy this site, they want a joint venture, they want to have a tenant, and so some combination of Central and the region goes to sell each project or help with the financing. So, but it is the regions that initiate the business, and Central looks at how we're going to finance it, and we're a little different than some other developers that preceded us, where they signed on whatever that partner wanted to do, they co-signed it, and they got into lots of trouble. And so we haven't been in that kind of situation, so we do control the finance centrally. And it is a one-stop shop. We've developed a management program that is the top in the world, the way we manage the properties and reduce the cost of running them. And we are a private company, and we are committed to quality. That is, if we can't build it, quality, it has to be junk, we're not interested. Okay? There's how the 4 regions, it was kind of interesting how they developed. The Midwest, you might say, started in Chicago, and then they said, oh, we've got some extra capacity, we'll move up to Canada. So they took on Canada. And then the Southeast, the CEO there left, and they took over the Southeast. Then they said, well, we think Brazil's an area of expansion, and they went down there and created a group, and we found a wonderful Scotsman that was born there, and he became our head of Brazil, and we have 250 people in Brazil. On the West Coast, we had a group that went from Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Orange County. And they said, well, let's move west. And so they went to China. And just a little further west. And so we started there, interestingly, with a emerging markets fund from TCW. And half the money was raised for industrial projects, and the other half was raised for real estate development. Well, they lost 100% of the industrial, and we're now selling a building in Moscow that will retrieve all the investors' money that they lost in the manufacturing side, and will return a nice return after 12 years. And so that's one of the things that happened. And then China got bigger and bigger, and we have operations. We started in Beijing, and we went to Shanghai, and we're also in Dalian. So, and it's rather exciting these days, because as the Chinese government wants to reduce the price of housing, they've changed, and so the value of what you thought you could build has reduced. So then the Southwest said, well, let's see, we'd like to go to Mexico. So they went to Mexico too. So that's how we got to those areas. And then we had a group that was actually the Southwest group, said, well, what about India and Poland? So they went to India, Poland, and Russia. And that's how that group got started, and we now have, I think we have 250 to 300 people in China today, and 250 people in Brazil, and then the Middle East, we had a group in Abu Dhabi that came out of London, that is supervised out of London, and who also supervises Spain, France, Italy, Germany, and we are hopefully have a project in Riyadh, because there's a lot of money being spent by the United States government to help the Saudis increase their defense position. So we are hopefully building a housing project there for the expatriates, and that's been very successful. So, and this is our project in Munich, uptown Munich, which means near the football stadium, and then there's one in Madrid, and the Renault site in Paris is a huge project also. Again, we were selected competing against 4 French developers. We won the right to build this project on an option basis. I mean, you just couldn't raise the kind of capital it takes to do a project of this size. And so we have options that we draw down, and we're about halfway, 60% of the way through this project now. And then of course you'll see very soon the project in Italy, which is the biggest project under development in Europe today. And is that just about, I think that's, but you're welcome to ask any questions. This is an interactive presentation, so hopefully you'll ask any questions anytime. Go ahead, Jay.
Just bounce these.
Jay, can I just make a very quick introduction? Jay Weifer is head of Hines Europe, also based in London. And following him, Greg Jones, who is the project architect and partner with Cesar Pelli. Cesar got sick just this morning, so could not be with us, but we're in great hands with Greg. And this is intended to be interactive, so please don't hesitate to ask questions. I know our students are not shy.
Go ahead.
I think the interesting thing to note on this slide is of the $36 billion that we have under management, 2/3 are what we call equity assets, means that Hines has equity money invested in the project, and 1/3 of those are projects where we're providing services for third parties but have no equity interest. So it goes to show that within the global development expertise, we provide a tremendous amount of services to third parties in addition to providing service on assets where we have ownership. Hines is known probably in the U.S. more as a developer than as an investor, but in fact we're one of the 10th largest property fund managers and have put together 28 investment vehicles with over $16 billion. Our global REIT, which is our latest effort, which is a private REIT but raising money publicly, so individual investors in the U.S. can invest in the Hines REIT, and we're raising between $8 and $10 million a week for that particular fund. And that fund has been buying assets. It's not a development fund, it's an acquisition fund. It's been buying assets primarily in Western Europe, Russia, Poland, and the US, and we hope to close on our first asset in Australia before Christmas. Jerry mentioned this slide. Again, one of the things the firm has done over time is to vertically integrate. And the reason for doing that is the synergistic approach that Jerry mentioned, which is our operating people are feeding information about systems efficiency and building efficiency back up to our design and conceptual construction people. We go all the way down to working with manufacturers and testing pieces of equipment. Manufacturers will regularly send us pieces of equipment and ask us if we will run tests on them and give them feedback. One of the new areas of technology we're spending time on today is LED lighting. We think it's going to be a great breakthrough in real estate. And the LED fixtures that are used on exterior buildings today have probably hit the point where they're commercially available and make sense. We're not quite there yet on interior fixtures. But literally, if you go into our conceptual construction group in Houston at the headquarters, every single one of their offices is lit by different LED fixtures. So we really take it into the office and test it out. And we're looking at glare, we're looking at light, we're looking at coloration, and then we're feeding information back to the manufacturers and saying, here are the changes you're going to have to make if you want us to use these fixtures in our properties worldwide. So it's a very close relationship. Jerry talks about pumps and fans and everything else. We really get down to the nitty-gritty of how do you operate top quality buildings more efficiently. And it's through this system that allows us to do that. The other point, Jerry talked about it, which is what we call top-down and bottom-up. This is not a firm where Mr. Hines tells everybody in the organization what type of real estate we're going to be developing. The firm has invested in people, and so those charts that you saw was really part of the philosophy of the firm, which is that we want to create local national teams on the ground that are working in their own country, their own culture, their own language. And they get to know the real estate. Because real estate, by and large, doesn't matter where you are in the world, is a local business. But real estate finance is a global business. So by top-down, bottom-up, what we say is that each country is going to write a 3-year business plan every year. And they're going to tell the firm what they think the best opportunities for investment in their country is. And then we try to bring the resources of the firm on a global basis to support those business decisions. So Hines Brazil right now has 2 major principal business lines, which are low-income housing and industrial. Completely different than Hines Russia, which has been doing high-end expat, if you will, or international offices, are now going into outlet malls. It's completely different than Hines Italy, which has been focused almost half and half on office and residential. Hines China, when we went into Brazil, the first project we did was expat housing because there was a shortage of that in the country. Today in China, we're doing domestic housing for the domestic Chinese. Part of that is the fact that Hines in China has grown up. We're much more sophisticated. The Hines chop and reputation in China has been established, and we can therefore broaden what we're doing. But it also reflects that the team on the ground in each one of these countries is looking at where they see opportunities and feeding it back to the company. So part of tonight, what we thought we would do is try to bring some of these basic concepts back in and do it through a case study. And the case study that we're going to present to you tonight is Italian-based. It's based in Milan, and it's called Porta Nuova. And I'm going to run through a series of slides and give you the background and context, and then do a section where I'm going to try to compare doing business in Milan versus doing business in Boston. And then at the end, Greg is going to come through and say, okay.
Throw China in if you want.
Greg's going to then come back and sort of say, okay, now let's take all these real estate concepts and show you what it means physically in terms of the buildings that are being developed. So, interestingly, in Italy, the business has 3 foundations. On the left-hand side, Hines Italia, which is the classic development company, the sponsor of the projects that we're going to show you. Hines Italia SGR is actually a fund management company. The laws changed in Italy. They changed regularly in Italy, but they changed in Italy on the fund side that required all the domestic pension funds to employ third-party fund managers. Well, we had seen that coming and had set up a fund management business, and so we immediately ended up with a series of funds. So we have pension fund of doctors, pension fund of journalists, pension fund of lawyers, all of whom have invested money with Hines, and we're out buying and doing renovation projects with them. And then on the right-hand side, because we're doing so much residential, and residential is such a special product, we've set up an entire residential arm which is focused primarily on the sales and management of the process and trying to create a high-quality image for Hines Residential. So again, that's an example of, again, one country's response to where they see opportunities within their country. The case study tonight is referred to as the Garibaldi, Verrazine, and Isola project. It's in fact 3 projects that we bought over a period of 6 years, early in the 2000s. The project is situated on the north side of central Milan. The Duomo, which everybody would consider is the old historic cathedral, is here. You can see the old ringed city when it was a walled city. And our project is on the north side. In terms of a sense of scale, the project is 800 meters in width. And when you compare that to what Milanese think of, what they relate to, so 800 meters is more than twice the Piazza San Duomo. It's wider than the two major public parks in the city. So scale is very important, and we have a lot of scale. When you then narrow down a little bit, what you see is one of the primary things that made this site so exciting to us, which is that it is adjacent to one of the major commuter rail stations and very close to the International Central Rail Station. It's also bisected by major north-south and east-west roadways. So it really is a hub on the north side of Milan. And it's only a kilometer of walking distance from the site into the Duomo. And a lot of those are pedestrianized streets.
Did you show them the two transportation centers?
I did. Here, the Garibaldi station and the Centrale station. So this is the three projects. The Garibaldi project, which is the first of the three that we acquired, is in red. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that process. The Verrazine project in the lower right in yellow, and then the Isola project, the last of the three, in the upper left in green. Interestingly, these represent 70 acres of land in the center of a major urban European city that had not been developed for 40 years. The question is why and how could that possibly happen? And the answer is the fact that they were heavily fractured between public and private ownership. In fact, there were over 20 private owners, plus the municipality or the city government of Milan, plus the regional government, which is the equivalent of the state government. And nobody could communicate, nobody had a big vision that could bring everything together. And quite frankly, in European governments, usually the city government and the regional government are different political parties and don't generally cooperate very well anyhow. So in this particular case, we were able to come up with the big vision to link all these projects together. And that's the story tonight. The process started in 2002 when our partner in charge of Hines Italia, a wonderful gentleman named Riccardo Catella, came up with the idea, which was, why can't we get the different groups of government to talk? And interestingly, under one of the earlier Berlusconi years, I think before he got sidetracked, one of the positive things he brought to Italy was forcing governments to talk and to try to create foreign direct investment by bringing governments to the table. And that was the first time that we were able to actually get the regional government and the city government at the table with us. And we proposed something that had never been done before. And that was to combine all of the public and private ownerships together, then do a single master plan, and to reallocate those ownership interests so that the regional ownership was in one location, the city in one location, and the private in a third location. And that was a breakthrough. Never been done before in Italy, and took us over a year of sort of planning to get it into place. But that's what unlocked this site.
Well, plus the
great work of Catella in getting 20 ladies, most of them ladies and grandmothers, to give us an option. We had to get an option on all 20, because if we had one holdout, they'd kill us. And he did. He sweet-talked those ladies, and he brought home 20 options.
I'd like to say that he had a vision that he communicated very well to a lot of family owners. But maybe that's the political response. So in the end, the left-hand chart shows you the public and private ownerships, how scattered they were. Interestingly, the upper left-hand or the upper right-hand corner, the large blue site, was a parking lot that Hines actually had to buy fairly early in the process. And today, that is the land that's under the new regional headquarters. So the land all moved around once we got the master planning done. So in the right-hand side, at the end of the master plan process, you basically have all of the regional ownership in the upper right-hand corner. That actually is the footprint of the building that they did a design competition that Pei Cobb-Fried did for them.
Jay, did you have any particular incentive to put a headquarters on the site that you had bought?
We didn't think it was bad. but we didn't have much control over it. I mean, again, it was a situation where we had public ownership that we obviously couldn't control to the extent it was brought all together in a common area. You knew something was going to happen. And the goal of bringing all of the public institutions effectively onto the site as our partner was very good in the long run of building that consensus.
Oh, it created just incredible critical mass.
Yeah. So this is now the new headquarters for the region of Lombardy, the state government. This is the site for the new headquarters of the city of Milan. Their existing headquarters building is here. That's as yet unbuilt. And what resulted was the Garibaldi site, the Verrazine site, the Isola site, and everything left over in the middle becomes what will be the third largest public park in Milan. And that's the basic master plan concept. But if we now go and look at each one of those three private projects individually, you see that on Garibaldi, we ended up with, all of this was part of the Garibaldi site, and what we ended up with after the master plan was this area of private ownership. And that's the master plan that Greg will present to you in a little while, which is how he took the master plan of the private sector known as Garibaldi and took it forward, and we'll show you what it looks like today. So the challenge here was to create a master plan, and then we took a public master plan, which quite frankly, Greg will show you, perhaps in your slides, that really didn't work commercially. And then Hines and Pelly together completely reworked and created this plan. I'm sorry, you had a question?
I was wondering, like in the early process, was there ever consideration of bringing other private partnerships into the development?
Actually, there are, and I'll show you a slide on that. This is too big a project for Hines to do by themselves, so every one of those three projects has multiple equity co-investor partners, as well as multiple bank financing partners, and I've got a slide on that. If we then, and this again was a period where we started talking to the families in 2002, we didn't actually close on all the land until 2004, 2005, so it was a lengthy period of trying to get the public on board, get a master plan everybody would accept before we actually put hard money on the table and we're actually buying sites. Sorry, there's a question back here?
Yeah, well, what drove the decision to reserve so much space as parkland to create the third largest park in Milan?
Well, it was really a combination of the fact that there was a large area that the boundaries of the property existed. The private ownership was a set figure. Clearly, the public government could have said, we're going to expand and create a sea of offices here, but their goal, again, being good public servants, was to say, let's create something for the community, some advantage. And the resulting area was left over in the middle, and the thought was, why don't we create a huge public park? So I'm not sure it was anything more simple than that. If you then go to the Verrazine site, for Hines, this was much easier than Garibaldi because we basically negotiated a purchase agreement and bought it on a particular day. But for the seller, it was a 10-year battle where he was actually in litigation with the municipality of Milan. The lawsuits went all the way to the equivalent of the Italian Supreme Court, and he won on appeal. And that was to get his buildable rights, his zoning, his FAR approved. And so we had been tracking it, working with him, sort of pre-negotiating, and the minute that the decision came out of the courts that established the buildability, we very quickly thereafter closed on the sale of that site. And when you go and look at the Isola project, again, similar issue. The seller was a developer who, if you'll notice, this site kind of is nestled up in a older part of the city. This is a really lovely working class neighborhood, but with very strong neighbors. And when he came up with the master plan for this site, that he had neighborhood opposition, he had claims from the neighbors, and the neighbors claimed against him and against the city for giving him the building permit. So he was basically frozen where he could not do anything with the site. And this was a major decision for Hines because we decided to go in and buy the property and take the risk that we could, through a series of community meetings and community workshops, come up with a new master plan that we could get community support for, and therefore the city would release. And that was not unlike when we did 222 Berkeley on the Back Bay here in Boston. We had tremendous, I think we ended up with something over 100 community meetings, presentations, and workshops in order to get that master plan approved. And it was not too different here, except here the meetings were church suppers, they were presentations in the neighborhood halls, going around and talking to all of the neighbors, trying to understand what they wanted, what they objected to, and was there a middle ground, which we eventually got to. Yes?
Given that level of risk, was the economic driver on that piece significant enough to drive your perspective to say, okay, we have to have this as a third piece, or could you have gone with the other two separately?
We didn't need it.
Go ahead, Jerry, say it.
We didn't need it.
This was a matter of the managing director of Hines Italia coming forward and saying, look, I think we can buy this at a discount because the developer's frozen. But it's a big risk. But I believe that based on the Catella family relationship, can go into this community and I can come up with a plan. And Jerry believed it. And in the end, we were successful in pulling it off. But it was a big risk.
It was a good bet. And you know, it's another one of those classic. It's another one of those classic examples of if you don't develop it, someone is going to come in and capitalize on all of the critical mass that they've provided and score a great big goal for them. So it was an interesting side bet on top of a much bigger bet.
Huge bet.
Not small money by any means for a side bet. So what was the whole process? This is a very simplified bar chart to sort of say, all in all, this project, even though it's 3 projects, it's being developed simultaneously, is a 12-year plan. It's a huge investment on the front end, and really you get most of your money during a 12-month period at the back end, because when you're doing residential, you get a little bit of money for deposits when you sell the units. Most of the money is when you hand over the keys at the back end. And the same thing, obviously, on the leasing of office space, you don't really recover the majority of your money until you sell buildings at the back end. So the Garibaldi planning process was very large at the front end, but once we had it in place, the project went fairly smoothly. Verrazine and Isola, again, relatively long planning periods, given the planning process in Italy, but once we got under construction, they've been able to move pretty effectively forward. But still 12 years. Okay, so now we've acquired probably one of the largest sites at that point in Milan. But remember, it had been a piece of land that had nothing built on it for 40 years. Greg was laughing earlier saying, well, we didn't have a lot of demolition to do because literally the site had no buildings on it.
It had been bombed during World War II.
Yeah, one portion of it had actually been bombed in the Second World War and never had been built on. So we did have to do a bomb and what we call an ordnance survey, where you actually go and look and see if there's buried ordnance, which you have to do in most of the cities in Europe. But the challenge here was one of communication. How do you communicate to the city of Milan what you're doing? And this is long before you build the first building. We had 3 different owners. Going back to the question, 3 different sets of equity participants. Each project had its own name, its own ownership, its own identity. But to the community at large, it was one big site. So how do you take this disparate issue and how do you create a marketing and a branding concept? So what we did was to create what we call an umbrella brand, and that's the Porta Nuova concept. And the gray shape is actually the direct image of one of the old historic gates. When I showed you the ring city around the aerial map, Milan actually was a ring city that had gates that people came into, and those gates, for the most part, are still standing and have been restored. So that represents the historic gate, and the green represents sustainability, which is really about the future. And so that's the logo type, and Porta Nuova relates to the entry into the new city. But we maintained 3 separate identities to respect the separate ownership of the 3 projects. We then recognized that residential is so important that we created an entire residential company and a separate branding for our residential. And then every building on the residential side has its own name, its own identity, its own brand, its own brochure. Because obviously when I'm trying to sell one of you a residential unit, you want to have an address, a building that has its own identity and its own dignity. We then roll that out. So long before we had any construction on site, we had very high quality site fences that began to identify the Porta Nuova brand. We had websites, we had Facebook pages, we had newsletters, all about communication to the community, telling them what we are doing. so that as thousands of cars drove by this site every day on those two major streets, they saw every day Porta Nuova and began to establish that name with that location. On the residential side, we created a separate visioning statement, a separate mission statement, and positioning all around the type of high-quality residential that we were building. And then we rolled that out with an entire branding and marketing program that relates just to the residential property. Whether it's direct mail, whether it's models and marketing centers, we have an incredible 3D fly-through computerized program, and we actually have built sort of model units for people to go see. So all in all, we now have assembled this site. We have created a brand and an image, and as you can see, this is a computer generation of the three projects together. It covers 70 acres, or 3.1 million square feet. And more importantly, from a development standpoint, it generated the rights to build the FAR using a US language of 6 million square feet. Of that, almost half is below grade. Now, it's not all parking because you use the space efficiently in Europe. The first level below grade is often retail, offices, shopping, and other elements. You have sort of mezzanine levels. So still, a tremendous amount of square footage to be putting on the market at one time. And anywhere you look, when you put all these together, the numbers are very large, whether it's land area, the tremendous pedestrian and plazas and other areas, the third largest park, all the way down to the total investment, which is going to be in the order of 2 billion euros. The question earlier about how did you deal with other ownerships and did you bring equity partners in? Yes, we did. On the Garibaldi project that came forward, Hines and one of the Hines investment funds put in the initial capital. We brought in a very large Italian insurance company to co-invest with us and be our partner. On the Verrazine project, we found a family Italian development company to come in as our initial partner, and then brought in another Italian fund to be the third partner, and then brought in a consortium that included our partner in the first project to be virtually an equal partner. And on the Isola project, we did something similar. So in all of these cases, it's a mix. You know, this Teachers is a U.S.-based pension fund. Within the Hines side of the funds are a series of major U.S. Institutional pension funds. So the equity financing on this project is a mix of Italian, European, and U.S. pension funds as well as private families. When you then look at on the debt side, again, huge effort. This is about a little over 1.6 billion euros of debt between the three consortiums. And the Garibaldi and Verrazine projects, by their sheer size alone, no single bank could handle it. But to give you an example, when we started Garibaldi, and Bank Intesa was the lead bank coming into there, they gave us a full construction commitment, full loan, and they took the responsibility to underwrite and to syndicate at a time when we didn't have a single building permit or a single tenant. So it was 2.4 million square feet of 100% speculative space without a building permit, and we got a 70% bank loan. That obviously today you wouldn't come close to any of that.
I was going to ask, what year was that?
That was in 2004 or 5, so at the peak of the period. So again, you know, your financing structures are incredibly important, both how you bring equity to the table, how you bring bank debt to the table, but the other part that's very important is literally how you structure the deal. So as an example, on the left-hand side, we started out with SPV, special purpose vehicle. So it was a unique setup. It was owned out of a Luxembourg partnership, which makes it tax efficient for the U.S. investors because you have tax treaties and you're not dealing with U.S. investors directly investing directly into Italian real estate. And effectively, that's an asset structure. The concept is that you invest into the development of assets. At the end of the day, you sell those assets and you pay tax. The Italians changed the law and introduced real estate investment trusts, which are instead of being REITs in the U.S., they're REIFs in Italy. And that allows you to effectively, instead of selling assets, you sell shares. So people invest by buying shares, and it creates a much more liquid market, particularly when you're dealing with the large scale we're dealing with. Because obviously, the bigger the investment asset, the smaller the number of people that it can afford to pay for it. But the minute you break it down into shares, you now open up a completely different market and a completely different structure. So it was a big deal. In order to go to an Italian fund model, we had to renegotiate every bank loan and every equity partnership agreement. It took us over a year and multiple millions of dollars to do it. But we think at the back end of this project, we could save or generate additional profit on the order of 40 million euros, simply from tax structure. Sorry, Rick?
I see you did this in 2009. Was that motivated by the financial crisis?
No, it was motivated by the legal changes in Italy, which introduced the reef concepts.
Did the financial crisis affect your operation in Italy?
That's a different question.
Yeah, yeah, we're sitting there with a 1 million square foot lease.
The bank Unicredito, and their debt, it's the biggest bank in Italy, and their debt has just been declared junk. So we've got an interesting ride to the end of our railroad.
That's another part of the story. I thought we put together a couple of slides because I thought sometimes, obviously this is a very multinational class, but I thought you're spending your time in Boston, you probably have a sense for what real estate development is like in Boston. And how does it compare to Milan? And there are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences. So if you'll bear with me, this is much to Greg's heart. How do you buy design services in Milan versus Boston? Well, actually,
Priceless.
Actually, it's fairly similar. Competitions are used heavily in Europe. In fact, in many municipalities, competitions are required as part of the process. So our preference is to do private competitions and limited competitions where we select a number of firms that we think have the experience and the ability and will be able to produce a good product for us. But we do end up doing competitions, both where it's voluntary and where it's required. And with regard to engineering and all the specialists, we typically do requests for proposals, again, from a pre-selected list. The cost of architectural services on a typical smaller single building site are actually in the same order of magnitude as a percentage of construction cost. But what happens when you get to this big scale is you have layers and layers and layers of architects and consultants. And so you end up with a multiple. So I would say that in Milan, the 10 to 12% is kind of where we thought it should be. I will tell you we've exceeded that number simply based on the number of consultants that we had to bring in to go through all the process. And in fact, on the 3 projects with 3 separate teams, we have over 20 different design architects working with us. And with each of those design architects comes engineers, comes specialty consultants, depending on the type of project. So simply from a management standpoint, it is a massive undertaking when you're doing something of this scale, and obviously the costs go up. One of the more interesting sides is the approval process. I talked a little bit about it, but I'll sort of bounce through here pretty quickly. From what we call planning, what you would call zoning here, in Boston, you're dealing with the BRA and the Board of Appeals. It's actually fairly similar, meaning it's pretty political. And the bigger the project, the more political it gets. In Milan, we have a separate architectural review committee, so you're presenting every material, every design, every detail, and they're making a decision whether they think it fits. And that's a separate decision from the normal sort of planning and building and approval process that you go through. And very often there is a public exhibition period and a public comment period that may or may not relate to a public claims period if the neighbors don't like what you're doing. When you then get basically outline approval and get into the building permit on each building, again, they're fairly similar. One of the interesting things is that Milan, in order to streamline government, created a new system called a DIA system, which is effectively a self-certification. So you have to get the fire marshal and the life safety approved. There's no justification. But if you think your building meets all the design codes, there's actually a self-certification system where you roll the dice and you say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and streamline this and speed through it. But obviously, if at some point in the future they decide you didn't, they'll freeze the project in its tracks. But it's an interesting approach to how government is trying to solve some of the logjam problems that they have. When you get to claims, again, you have claims in the US, but in Europe in general, virtually anybody that can say they have a they've had an impact or they have a relationship with that project can make a claim. And the claim has an incredible variety, but the key thing is that once you get an approval rate, there's a 60-day, what they call a white period, where you probably don't want to start construction on site, because that's the open time frame for last claims before you start construction. So literally, after you go through the entire process and get approval, there's a one last chance for the public to come in and claim against your project. And those claims can be literally to throw the building permit out, to freeze the building permit and have a discussion, or simply, I've been damaged by this, the project can go forward, but it's a monetary discussion. There are things called rights of light that I know we have similar things in the U.S. and literally on 222 Berkeley, when we had to redesign the top of the building because we threw shadow on a public playground. But in Europe, it goes even farther to the point where any residential building that surrounds your project, there's a diagram. You take a 60-degree angle line from the windowsill of those occupied units, and that creates a three-dimensional envelope within which you can build without the risk of claims. You can also break it, but if you break it, you subject yourself to one of those types of claims. So every project that we do in most of the European cities, we do a 60-degree or the equivalent that you would have in France and Spain or Germany, and we look at what's the envelope that you can develop within without risking claims, and then you make a careful judgment where you want to expand that building. It also gets down to where you put tall buildings and where you put short buildings, based on the context or the buildings that are adjacent to your site. I think in terms of approval, they're both very political. What's interesting is that in the U.S., you typically have a mayor and a council that's in power. That's the political side. In Europe, and certainly in Italy, every political party, and there are usually 4 to 6, not 2, every political party has their own staff. So every political party, on the project we did in Barcelona, the project we're doing in Milan, have city planners, architects, urbanists, all of whom want to talk to you about quite detailed discussions about your design. And it's a little bit like Henry Kissinger doing shuttle diplomacy when he was in, where you're literally trying to get each political party to sign off so that you end up coming together when you finally submit with a consensus that can be approved. On the fee side,
to tell them about our Steca and the
well,
party of the left that we had to.
On the Isola project, in the middle of that site was an old, run-down ruin of an old factory building. Literally, it was a ruin. But a group of people had squatted in it and had occupied and created makeshift areas. Most of them we think were for more illicit purposes, but some of them said they were artisans, and this was sort of their little laboratory. Well, it's interesting, the far left political party also put their local party campaign headquarters in that building. So once we bought the building, we then had to gain actual control and possession. And that took us months to go through all the legal possession. We finally had to move in at early one morning with the
5 o'clock.
With the police and the political support to actually take control of that building back. So it's very political. On the fee side, in Boston, we pay impact fees. There's a housing linkage fee and a jobs creation fee. But those are pretty much formulaic, where you have an idea based on how many square feet you're going to develop as to what you're going to have to pay. In Milan, you have the same thing. You have a fee that's set as construction, but in addition to that, you have to contribute to on and off-site infrastructure and public buildings, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. So the quantum, the order of magnitude, is significantly bigger in terms of what the public infrastructure contribution is in Europe in general, Milan certainly, than it was for us in Boston. And so here you go. If you go down to the bottom and you go all the way through these two columns, order of magnitude in Milan, the combination of those three contributions will be about 100 million, which works out to about $35 a square foot. If you go back to what we paid in Boston in the 1990s when we did 222 Berkeley, it was 42 cents a square foot, and then what you negotiated was how many years you paid it for. And I think we paid it for about 10 years. So that ends up to about $4.20. So you got a sense for 8 to 10 times the public infrastructure contribution in Milan and in Europe than what we see in the U.S. If If you then go into construction, the way you buy construction in Europe is not unlike what you do in the US. The big difference is that in Europe, you typically go out to bid with full design development documents, not full CDs. Now, I'll tell you that in Milan, we took the American model in and we did full CDs. Actually, Greg did full CDs. But that was because we wanted to protect ourselves from having a contractor decide he wanted to interpret our drawings and produce a different quality than what we had in mind. You typically do competitive RFPs. Sometimes you do packages as opposed to a lump sum. Interestingly, in terms of the way you build construction, you can actually do your excavation as part of a soil decontamination permit well in advance of an actual building permit. So it's a roll of the dice. You can get 4 to 6 months advance on your construction by doing the excavation. But then you have a very big expensive hole in the ground if you don't get your building permit on time. Sorry, Jerry. Yeah.
Why don't you explain what CDs and DDs are?
Well, I think if the 3 phases of design, for those of you not in the design school, you have SD, schematic design, which is coming up with a 3-dimensional form of the buildings. You begin to talk about the style of architecture, and it's enough to get an initial budget on. DDs, which is design development, is basically flushing out those to the point you've got pretty tight design drawings. Again, in Europe, tight enough to go out to bid, but certainly not something we would typically do in the US. And full construction documents, or CDs, are literally the drawings that are the last step before you go to manufacturing documentation or shop drawings. So again, those are the 3 phases. And in Europe, they tend to be more streamlined, I guess, in the process, but take larger risk in terms of the quality then it gets produced. Interestingly, now when you start getting into the business side of it, how do you calculate area? Well, GBA, or gross built area, is pretty much the same coast to coast. It's the outside edge of one end of the building to the outside edge of the other end of the building, and that's what you buy from the construction contract. So clearly that's something that it's based on your zoning, based on the amount of space you're allowed to build, and that's the construction basis. Net rentable area is interestingly very different. In the US, you have the BOMA, the Building Owners and Managers Association, who establishes a standard. There are 2 or 3. There's actually a New York net rentable that's a completely different definition of rentable, where you actually have sometimes more rentable area than you have gross. But in
New York.
But in Milan, there was not a real standard, so it tends to be fairly negotiable. If you have a single tenant building, rentable and gross are the same thing. You literally rent them every inch of the building, the elevators, the facades, etc. And that's our focus, which is what's the ratio of rentable to gross. So when we sit and have our very intense conversation with our architect, it's trying to get that ratio as high as we can. We'd like that to be in the 90th percentile, which means effectively it's the shafts, the stairwells, the elevator shafts, and everything else are what you can't rent. Now, obviously, it's more than that, but singularly, that's what we're focused on, which is the efficiency of the rentable to the gross. But the tenant is looking at the usable area, what we often call carpetable. That's the area that he can use. And when we're negotiating with a tenant, the tenant's looking at that ratio, which is different. So there's an inherent difference between what we're looking at with the contractor and with the architect and what the tenant's looking with us. In Italy, there's also something called SLP, which is it's effectively the zoning area calculation. It's not used in the US, but it's very similar to zonable area, or somewhere halfway between rentable and usable. The very interesting thing is, because of the rights to light that relate to employees, the office floor plates in Italy, and true pretty much throughout Europe, tend to be about half the size what they are in the US. So if we're typically looking at a gross 20 to 25,000 square foot floor plate as being an optimum Class A office building floor plate, in Europe we're really talking about half that. And that gets back to, there is a formula based on the amount of glass in the exterior of the building, how far away from that glass you can put an occupied desk. So if you have a very deep floor, everything in the middle of that floor could be a conference room, it could be storage, but it can't be occupied area. So you typically tend to get much narrower buildings. And then we get down to that efficiency question. Again, we're looking to push this into the low 90s. In Milan, I think with regs, we ended up getting up all the way up into the mid 80s, but that's much more efficient than typical. And that's, again, from a competitive standpoint, you want to try to be more efficient than the buildings you're competing against. And that's what this design process this close interaction between the architect and the developer is all about. It's trying to work that ratio to the point where that becomes very effective for the tenant. Lease structures are also a significant point of difference, and this gets back to touching every part of the business. If in Boston we're doing triple net or base year lease concepts, for those of you that don't know what a triple net basically means, the tenant pays for everything. But the landlord controls the building, controls all the services, controls all the utilities, and then allocates those costs to the tenants based on a pro rata basis of their area versus the total area of the building once a year. In Europe, you tend to use what's called a full repair and insuring lease. Now, from an investment standpoint, it's ideal, because what that means is that the tenant separately contracts and is responsible for cleaning, security, maintenance, repair and maintenance, including the mechanical system in their space, to insure all that space and to actually buy the utility direct from the utility company. So literally, the landlord has, the lease is a bond. There's very little exposure for the landlord, and they get a very high quality relationship between the gross rent and the rent that's actually effective rent for them. The landlord literally is only responsible for the common areas in the building, which could be the lobby, but if it's a single tenant building, there's no common area. And the structure, the waterproofing, the enclosure. So he basically insures the enclosure of the building so that the tenant can do everything else on the inside. And this creates a completely different approach to what I'll call tenant services, to the quality of tenant services. And if you think about sustainability, which is on everybody's agenda this day, it's very hard to be fully sustainable when you don't control all those things. So the property manager in the US is a full service manager. There's a close relationship with the tenant, and a fairly high service fee that relates to all those services. In Europe, the property manager effectively sends out the rent check and does the accounting. A separate facility manager who's the building engineer may or may not be on site of the building, answers hot and cold calls and takes care of problems. The leasing is outsourced, so you really have very little tenant action and a relatively low service quality. So the typical property management function in Europe is completely different than it is in the US. Again, going through this and just looking at sort of leasing and brokerage rents, typically on a $1 per square foot basis, rents in central Milan tend to be 10 bucks higher than they are in Boston. Operating expenses are completely different because this is full service including taxes, and this is not full service and not including very much of anything. So again, it's really different. The delivery condition in the US, you typically provide a core and shell plus a work letter or plus money so the tenant can fit out the way they want to. In most of Europe, you provide them space that the only thing they have to do is put the carpet in and then they can move the furniture in. So it's what's called Cat A finished. And pre-rent changes every month these days. The final point from the comparison, I mentioned the sustainability. In Boston and in the US, you have the USGBC, the Green Building Council, it's established the LEED system, very well respected, very well followed, very pragmatic and practical, and in fact now the US Department of Energy has created the Energy Star program. So LEED deals with design and construction, Energy Star deals with operations. So between those two you have a pretty good cross-section that the real estate community has embraced. The dilemma is when we started this project there was no such thing in Italy. And so the question was, Jerry Hines has said every one of our buildings is going to be sustainable. We're going to apply sustainability as is appropriate in each country. What is that in Italy? Well, there wasn't anything. I think you all have gotten drilled into you what sustainability means, but we like this chart because it basically, this is sustainability as it applies to real estate. What it says is that a truly sustainable project has to touch all three of these circles. And so the project from an economic standpoint has to make sense. The numbers have to work, obviously, or the project doesn't go forward. But as part of that, you touch the social side, which is jobs creation and creating benefit and investment benefit in the community, and that you're basically dealing with something that the community wants, or at least you're solving the community's issues or responding and listening. And then on the ecology side or on the planet side, sometimes this is called people, planet, profit. On the ecology side, that the design and the construction is being done in a sustainable way. And a lot of times people only think about this when they think about sustainability in real estate. But in fact, it really is the full model if you're going to be a sustainable project. As I mentioned, in the US, you have a very simple program that's well established, but in every one of the countries we do business with in Europe, you have a different system. In the Middle East, you have different systems. And then sometimes you're measuring the carbon footprint, sometimes it's corporate social responsibility. EPC is a unique thing to the EU, which is an energy performance certificate that you have to actually display in the lobby. So again, the difference between Boston and Europe is a completely different scene, and yet there's a lot of overlap. So Hines is probably one of the principal partners in LEED and Energy Star in the U.S. But when we've gone to to Europe and France, our buildings are all done under HQE. In Germany, under DNGB. And in BREEAM, which is founded in London in the UK, we've actually taken BREEAM to Moscow because it seemed like something was applicable there. When we then got down to looking at Milan, we thought that if possible, we would like to take a system that we knew so well, which was LEED. And so we actually worked with the Green Building Council to import LEED to Italy, created the Porta Nuova project as a pilot LEED project, and translated all of the LEED standards into Italian, and worked with Greg and his team, because Garibaldi was the test case, to make sure we could apply all those in Italian and then get USGBC to certify us. Rick?
Can you just take a moment to contrast, or of all these different sustainability measures, which one would you prefer to build under, and which one do you think is most effective?
Well, the different countries have different systems for different reasons, and they are different by country. So some countries are more focused in some areas than others. The QSAS, the one that's in the Middle East, deals with the unique biology and ecology in the Middle East, which is very different than anywhere else, and it also has some cultural values and points in there in terms of cultural heritage. That's something that's not in any of the others. LEED we find to be very pragmatic, but clearly one of the failings is that LEED is based on design and construction and doesn't talk about operations. So you can design a great building, and move a tenant in who operates inefficiently. It may be LEED Gold, but it's terrible from an energy efficiency standpoint. And there's no common system anywhere in the world today that deals with all of those systems. And in fact, today we're seeing a proliferation of new groups coming in saying, well, let's create a new system. LEED is undergoing, I think they're up to LEED 2009 now?
Yes.
And that's in process, and that will change LEED. So literally the bar is being raised every couple of years between all these systems. I think more than anything else, it's a system that's well explained, pragmatic, and that you can apply. It doesn't matter. That's the reason why we've worked with DNGB and HQE and BREEAM. Those work in those communities are well understood by the practitioners. I think when you start talking about global investment is where you have an issue. If you're a global investor and you're trying to understand how sustainable different buildings are, you need a magic decoder ring to try to understand, what a BREEAM Excellent versus a LEED Gold means. But in that sense, a number of those systems have actually sat down and tried to work out the comparable language. But you also have others that don't. So it's a big challenge. So in the end, on these big public-private partnerships, for the project to be successful, you have to have collaboration. You have to have everybody coming together. And having the political support is critical to be successful. In Milan, we had a mayor who was really understood the benefit to their community of foreign direct investment, of creating jobs, of creating a new downtown that had state-of-the-art office buildings that would attract outside companies to come in and move and invest in Milan. And obviously, the spin-off was a tremendous amount of private money going into public infrastructure, creating the park, creating all these additional buildings. It's important to have an architect that has not only the world-class reputation that Caesar Pelle's firm does, but can really get in and work closely with the local community, whether it's the mom and pop that own a piece of land that you're trying to convince that they should share your vision and come on board with you, or the mayor or the head of the region.
And when Caesar went and we presented him to the community, he had to go back and talk about his grandfather who had come over from Italy to Argentina. And he got a lot of accolades on that one.
And I think at the bottom on the project of this size, you ultimately have to have a sponsor who has a vision. These projects don't get built by themselves. They don't get developed and leased and marketed by themselves. In the end, you've got to have somebody there that has this big vision and is willing take the time and push it all the way through. The public meetings that we started early in the process, we still have public meetings on a regular basis. Part of that communication process is still staying in front of the community, letting everybody know what we're doing, celebrating all the various milestones that you have going through these projects, and trying to make sure that everybody's on board as part of the team. You're always going to have naysayers, but to the extent that you have been a good community and a good steward of the built environment, then in the end you'll find that you have more people supporting you. And that's what it takes to get these big projects through.
Tell them about Catella. Catella is the son of...
So the bottom picture, Manfredi Catella, the founder of Hines Italia, Riccardo Catella, was Manfredi's father. He tragically passed away from cancer in the middle of this project. We were fortunate enough to have father and son in the firm. And so Manfredi, who had grown up walking construction sites with his father, stepped in and took over the project and is now the visionary leading this project that his father started and finishing this project 12 years later. And that's it. So now I thought what might be interesting, that's sort of the challenges of real estate development on a global basis. I thought what we might do is turn it over to Greg, let Greg sort of run through a little bit on we're going to focus on just this Garibaldi area and say, we took all this master planning, all these concepts, gave them to Peli and said, okay, now let's come up with something that will really sparkle in Milan, that will bring tenants to this location and create tremendous value.
We actually only have about 15 more minutes.
Okay.
So keep that in mind.
You're always rushing.
Rushing.
All right. Well, I had half the number of slides as last time, so at least I stand a chance. Okay.
Good presentation.
And that's it. This shows you the macro plan of Milan, and Jay pointed out that Garibaldi, Porta Nuova is in the northern west quadrant. This shows you the site. This portion is Garibaldi, and this is a tracery of the central part that was part of a precursor original master plan. This was the very first sketch of this particular idea that I did, and there are two ideas at work here on this particular project. One is the issue of interconnectivity. It was really important that whatever we do, it needs to be able to reach out and connect to these landmarks and to existing infrastructure and to neighborhoods. The other thing was to not create a collection of buildings, but it was much more about creating a public place around which we composed buildings. This is one of the principal challenges of this particular site, in that the northern half was 6+ meters higher than the southern half, and the east and west as well. This is one of the original master plan basic models, which we showed Jerry and Jay in London. And what it does do is it begins to map out just a basic idea of any typical piazza in Italy is usually square or rectangular. To me, it was most important for us to create a piazza that was omnidirectional. It was important to create almost an iconic piazza, so that every time we brought people in from these key directions, you always felt like you were coming into the center of the piazza, not coming in off a side or an end or a back or a front. This shows the final project dropped in. And what we've done is the creation of this raised public piazza, which is at street level for the park, but it's 6+ meters above the neighboring south, east, and west. Here you begin to see that the project completely hovers over not one, not two, not three, but 4, 5, 6 different below-grade infrastructure train systems. And the idea of this project would then, it comes down to the street level to the north, but it is raised up to the south, and we have to sort of reach out, and we take this critically important street, Corso Como, and we begin to pull that life and energy up and into the project. And once you're up here, if we've done our job right, you really feel like you're at street level. This begins to show you just a slice of the complexity of these rail systems that were all underneath the project, and there's a whole other series over there as well. This was the basic diagram, which talks about the building placements A, B, C, E1, E2, formulating around the piazza itself, connections to Corso Como, the rail station, the park, and to the neighboring streets. What we then had to do is begin to sit down and compose the building from a massing point of view. How do you begin to place and compose an X number of square meters on the site? To us, it made a lot more sense to locate the residential in the southern portion, which is immediately adjacent to the existing residential area. It made sense to make a much lower building toward this southern edge, and as the project began to rise, it got taller and taller. And that is essentially the basic master plan criteria. Here we show one of the most important things I mentioned earlier was the creation of not just a collection of buildings, but a central piazza which had interconnections. This is the major piazza in which we created a water feature, which then drove and concentrated the energy around the periphery. From wall to wall, it was about 100 meters, about a soccer field. And it's quite a task to animate and activate and bring life to a space that's 100 meters in diameter. But by creating a water feature, which then concentrates the energy around the perimeter, we were able to bring life and activity to the retail, 2 stories, continuing the architectural character of Milan in an arcade, but to make it skylit in this case, to bring vegetation to an Italian piazza, which is almost nearly unheard of. And this is a picture of it today. To Hines' credit, they accepted a challenge to begin to introduce sustainable energy, and yes, they got a FAR or SLP bonus, but it was a real commitment. And what we did is to introduce the solar panels in a very highly visible location, not just up on a roof. So it made sense to me to actually make it a kind of a delicate pixelated pattern, which would then animate the entire roof so that as you're walking underneath it, you're aware of this energy source. This shows the piazza as it extends out toward the rail station. The project is remarkably sophisticated in a vertical mode. There are many levels of below-grade parking interconnected with ventilation shafts. There's an upper-level piazza and a lower-level piazza. There's retail that can extend up as well as down. It's a very rich sectional diagram. And this just begins to show you some of the ventilation shafts which we've taken advantage of, and will create an indoor lower piazza, which is enclosed, which is directly below the upstairs exterior piazza. We'll do a quick case study of one of the buildings, Tower A. This begins to show you the idea of this cascading, spiraling, stepping, massing strategy of the lower buildings to the south, which allows sunlight in at the piazza, and the buildings slowly rise as they come up to the park. As Jade mentioned to you, in Europe, Germany especially, but Italy as well, there are a series of legislations which really govern the right to daylight from a worker point of view. And what it does is it it genuinely throttles you on just the ability of how deep a lease space that you can create. It seems like a harmless little line item, but it really begins to affect architecture tremendously. It really made this lease depth, which would be normally in the US 45 feet plus a core and another 45 feet, this whole thing is barely 18, 19 meters. Remarkably tight. What it forced us to do is to take elements of the project and propel them to the ends. It forced us, but it definitely encouraged us to take the core, which is often centrally located, and offset it deep into the one side, so that you begin to create as much open, this is a low-rise elevator core, and that drops off, as much open space and as much usable efficiency as is humanly possible. Early on, we realized that there was a very interesting and unique sort of attitude in the Milan zoning code, obviously mostly used for residential, in which balconies don't count as FAR or SLP. You pay to construct it, but it doesn't come off of your amount of buildable area. So what was interesting is that we were intrigued with the possibility of what this could do, because it clearly created a leasing amenity for this office, this conference room, or that particular office. But I was equally interested in what could it do for us architecturally. We'll go back to that in 1 second. This gets to that one issue that Jay spoke about just a few minutes earlier. This is a very typical size office building we did for Hines, 1500 Louisiana in Houston. And it's a 25,000 square foot floor plate with 45-foot lease steps, which is about 13.5, 14 meters. You can see it's 14, that's another 10 or 11, that's another 14. This is a remarkably typical office building size and dimensions. You can see it's radically different in this particular Milanese prototype. What intrigued me especially was, how can we take this leasing amenity, this zoning oddity, and how can it be exploited even further to create a design differentiation in the marketplace? What it enabled you to do, is that when you create these balconies, you actually disengage the outer wall from the rest of the building massing. What it begins to do is it really allows you to take an already pretty gracefully thin proportion and allows you to then break it up not once, not twice, but 3 times. So you begin to create this very unique expression on the outside of the building, to which we began to refer to it as a sail. And you can see on the southern wall, we employed very deep 650, 700 millimeter deep sunshades. But on the northern face, it was remarkably taut. But when you don't have to close the massing, it really frees you up to be far more sculpturally playful on this exterior wall. And it really creates a very interesting dynamic of the southern side with the remarkably deep sunshades compared to the northern side with very, very taut exterior wall. We then decided that the Tower A really needed to be the culmination of this stepping dynamic composition. And the project needed to announce itself on the skyline, and it needed to anchor itself as to create an entrance portal to the project, as well as an entrance portal to the park itself. What we chose to do is to take this idea of a sail wall, begin to ever so tightly wind these to create not just a very classic or static campanile, but something much more dynamic, so that when you're in the western side of Milan and you're looking up at the tower top, you're looking at a very different tower top than if you're over in Verrazine and you're looking at the tower top. It allowed to create a very dynamic presence on the skyline. And about 4 weeks ago, our helicopter friends built it for us. This is the piazza as it was just a couple of weeks ago. This is a picture of the lobby. And this is some exterior shots just taken a couple days ago.
Really outstanding. I'm a little bit of a sailor, and I love that building. Rick, I know you want to get to questions, so.
Well, yes, we're virtually out of time, but
Rick, we'll stay around as long as there are questions. How about that?
okay, well, we do have time for 1 or 2 questions from the floor if anyone wants. I know you had a very good one, so if you want to.
Oh, I was if you don't mind sharing, what are some of the returns on these projects? Only if you're comfortable. the anticipated returns on the project like this to induce you to take such a huge risk on such an investment.
Well, the investors are typically looking for a upper teens internal rate of return.
Okay.
You typically, from a hurdle standpoint, from our point of view, unless you get to about 15%, there are potentially better investments somewhere else. And then the return is related to the amount of risk you take. So the riskier the project, you'll find people that therefore want to have IRRs that have a 2 in front of them instead of a 1 in front of them. But that's sort of risk and reward. So the thought is if you take more risk, you should get a higher return on it. But I would say in a lot of the European countries, it's very hard to generate IRRs into the mid-20s. You're typically in a much better, if you're going to try to generate those types of returns, you're trying to buy buildings. You know, if those of you that are in the business school that know the internal rate of return is heavily time weighted.
They
so
better know it in the design school too.
Okay. So the longer your money is out, typically the greater drag on the IRR it has. So there are a lot of things you can do. One is you don't pay for the entire site up front. When you think about site cost, in the US, a typical site as a percentage of the project cost is about 20%. In Europe, it typically is 50%. So to the extent you pay for all of your land up front, it just kills your IRR, which is why Jerry said on the Garibaldi project, we did everything under option. We simply couldn't afford to buy the entire site up front and then take that 4-year process to get planning approval. And so that's one way you try to juice the IRRs on these bigger projects. Obviously, to the extent you get a high percentage of debt, that has a tendency to push up your IRR. So again, you're trying to say, how much debt am I comfortable with? And how much debt is available in the marketplace. That's certainly changed a lot, as we mentioned, over the last couple of years, in terms of trying to generate higher IRRs.
On that related note, how did you deal with absorption in this project? Because it seems like there's a lot of real estate involved, even for a city the size of Milan. So how did you think about phasing in absorption?
We leased 1 million square feet to Unicredito. That's
a lot of
so we have 500,000 to go on the office space. And we're doing very well on the residential. We're right on schedule. And that's all being sold at roughly 9,000 euros per square meter. Pretty good price.
I'm going to have to keep Jerry honest with that. He constantly tells us we're behind schedule on a residential sales. So I'm glad to hear him say publicly that we're on schedule. I mean, I do think for each different type of asset, you have to look at a different plan, because residential, we actually started selling residential units 3 years before delivery. Never been done before. And we've been selling all of those residential units. Admittedly, we think we're selling a very high quality unit with a very nice interior design and a finishing package. But still, 3 years is a long time for people to put money out before they're actually going to get the benefit of that asset. We've been able to sell on pricing plan, which means we price them appropriately for that quality of unit. But admittedly, these are high-rise residential units. There are only 2 other high-rise residential units in all of Milan. So again, it was a big risk. We're taking a product type that's not traditional and selling it in the community. So there are a lot of risks, but we put together a plan and an absorption plan. We don't release all the residential at once. We drip it into the marketplace so that we don't cannibalize our sales as much as possible. On the office side, clearly we wanted to attract a couple of large users. And as Jerry mentioned, we're very lucky with UniCredit. We're now 50% pre-leased with our offices. On the retail, it's only 500,000 square feet, but still a lot of area. But retailers, typically the big retailers, may begin to talk to you 2.5 years before delivery, but the smaller retailers won't talk to you more than 12 months before delivery. So again, you sit and you look at that 12-year plan, and you begin to look at each asset type or each type of product, and each one of them has a different gestation period as to when you're going to physically be able to get into the market and begin to get real responses.
We have time for 2 more questions.
The buildings are significantly taller than what else?
True.
What you see in Milan. How was that received in the community?
It's been received
Very well.
It's been received surprisingly well.
You don't lease 1 million square feet unless.
No, exactly. I mean, do people see this as a modern landmark in the city? I imagine there was some kickback against it. How was that process negotiated?
I don't think there's a kickback.
I don't think it was a kickback.
No.
I mean, it clearly.
They really liked it because they're an international bank. I mean, they are a big bank, second largest bank in Germany, in Poland. They're big in Turkey, they're big in Russia. So this was an important headquarters for them, and they wanted to look more like New York than Milan.
Yeah, from the municipality standpoint, they were very focused on FDI. They were focused on contributions to the tax base, jobs, all the things that you would expect a municipality to be focused on. They were very tough on us on our design reviews, but no different than you would get in Boston. So the pushback, we did have claims from a number of neighbors. I think some of them claimed because they had their hand out, they saw an opportunity to try to get paid for something. And we did make some building adjustments based on that 60-degree rule, trying to make sure that we didn't violate that and didn't create issues.
Milan is a very sophisticated city, and as a group, they were smart enough to realize that you can either grow horizontally and start creating these sub-centers further and further outside the city, or you can grow vertically. And it isn't an either or. It's a smart development combination. A smart development strategy is a combination. And you could see just from how the city, how the region chose to do their new headquarters is in a 40-story building. It wasn't a huge sale. It was a. They seemed as a culture, as a city. It wasn't as big a deal as you might think.
I think if you look at the concept of transit-oriented development that you're seeing in an area where you have the infrastructure in place and you have public transit in place, that's where municipalities want density of people. And so that's what we had here, and one of the reasons why we got that support for the tall buildings.
Let's take 1 more question. Yeah.
Yeah. You spoke briefly about the various co-investors behind those 3 components of the project. You also said that it's simply you can't afford to pay the land cost in full just because of the IRR. So can you just talk in details how at different stage of the project, it's a 12-year timeline, different investors with different risk and return profiles have been involved in the project? And also a related question is, internationally we see a trend where companies have 2 arms, one is development, the other one is sort of investment, asset management. So once the project evolves and stabilizes, sort of transfer to the arm where you have a lot of private or public investors, so sort of going asset-light models. Is that the way that Hines is going?
I think in the answer to the first question, you don't allow investors to come in and go out. So the investors all bought into the financial model at the beginning, which had a target IRR and target rents and target time frame and target costs. So they're either like-minded at the beginning when they get on the train with you, or they don't come on at all. So there's really a single period of time where they basically, it's like raising a fund where everybody comes in and says, okay, we're going to do this. We believe in this project. We do a lot of presentations, We try to do all that visioning and explain to investors why we think this makes sense. And then we get down to the detail. We go through every line item in the budget, every line item in the cash flow, and try to get their investment committees on board with this. But at the point that they're committed on the project, they're on it till the end. I think in terms
Can't
of
get off.
in terms of your second question, which is within the ability to move asset to asset, there's nothing we would like better to do than to develop a project under a development fund at Hines and then sell it to a long-term hold type fund. But you raise tremendous potential conflicts of interest, and typically if you're an investor with us in a project and we've developed it with you, you want us to sell that project for the highest price possible and get you the highest return. If I then say to you, I'm going to sell the building to Jerry, you're going to say, well, how do I know I'm getting the highest price? And ultimately, there's no solution to that except to take it to market. And it's something that I think Jerry and I...
Doing it in Brazil.
It grates us every week of the year because we develop some of the best buildings in these cities. We would love to own them long term. But we can't deal with the inherent conflicts and the fiduciary responsibility we have to our co-investors not to take them to market and prove that we're getting them the highest price at the back end. So it's a very frustrating part of the business, but when you do a development model where you have co-investors, you have to respect those co-investors. You have to do the right thing for them, regardless of what you want to do.
Jerry, would you like the last word?
Well, I think that the development business worldwide is very challenging. It's been a lot of fun for me. I left the U.S. 15 years ago and went to UK when my son became the CEO, so I knew who was in charge. But I've enjoyed the whole experience in Europe and Asia and the Middle East. I've gotten to know those countries, and I don't think you can really ever know a country unless you do business in there. And when you do business and you work with the legal profession, you work with the construction people, you work with the contractors, you learn that business. And I can say Europe was very, you'd think you might have trouble in Italy or France. No, that has not been our experience. But in Spain, wow, watch out. I mean, we've learned some big lessons, haven't we, Jay? And Jay headed our Spanish operation when we first went there. So I think it's been a great adventure, and it's been very educational for me and our family. And we still have some challenges out there, and we hope to execute those in the manner that will benefit our investors, and to do it in an ethical way. And when you're operating in places like Moscow, I mean, there are a lot of potential problems there, and we say no on a lot of things that are very hurtful for us. But we have partners in all of these. So far, we've had selected very good partners, and they've helped us through these areas, but it is not without problems. Any other questions? I'm happy to answer anything, but Rick, you're in.
Well, I hate to ring the gong. I really want to thank the two people who run the Real Estate Academic Initiative with me, Cynthia Henshaw and Sharon Limbo, who pulled off a monumental effort to plan all of today's activities, and Beth Kramer, who's head of development, who was overall in charge. So Jerry, thank you for an incredibly stimulating day, and for bringing Jay and Greg, and we'll look forward to your being back in the spring.
Well, that's what I understand. I'm going to be back again. Sorry, guys.